Welcome to the Global Discussion, discussions with creatives, leaders and thinkers. My name's Simon Hodgkins. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Charlotte Otter. Charlotte, before we begin and I get into some questions that I really want to ask you, I'm going to take a moment and get you just to tell us a little bit about the world of Charlotte Otter, talk a little bit about Reputation 360 and just help us set the framework here for what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and I'm delighted to be with you on your podcast. I'll try and keep it short. So I'm a South African who spent most of my career living and working in Germany. So I kind of straddle north and south. And I started out as a journalist. I wrote 2 novels, crime fiction set in my home country. I have worked for a very long time in corporate communications. And 3 years ago, I left my big corporate job to set up a communications advisory of my own. And at the same time, went back to university for the first time in 30 years. So I set out to do an MSc. And the MSc I chose was a course in change leadership run jointly by Oxford Said Business School and HEC Paris. And the reason I chose change leadership was that I realized that all communications in corporate is about change. So no leaders ever get up on stage and say, hey guys, I'm here to tell you everything's staying the same. And I wanted to develop a more academic understanding of change. From the course came a thesis on reputation. So I looked at how the CEO and the head of comms build trust to manage and mitigate reputational risk. And I did very well in my thesis. And I said to my 2 professors, I should carry this on. I should do something. And the one said, do a PhD, and the other said, write a business book. The business book sounded easier and shorter. So that's what I did. I've written a book called We Need New Leaders, which sits at the intersection of reputation, diversity, and leadership. And I also work as a communications consultant, working directly one-to-one with leaders on a program that I call the Reputation 360.
Well, thank you, Charlotte. You've took us a little bit around the world there, and you've introduced us a little bit to everything that you're doing. So you transitioned from, if I'm hearing you correctly, from journalism into corporate and now into this new exciting world that you have. And do you think that being a journalist, first and foremost, has helped you? Do you see anything from back then to what you're doing today?
Yeah, I feel like I use my journalism skills every day. You know, being a good journalist, you have to ask good questions. You have to be a listener. You have to be relatively persuasive and potentially a little bit charismatic, although we don't all get that right. You've got to be able to write very clearly. You have to be able to write to deadline. And it's specifically the lessons around writing and communicating clearly and writing to deadline that I think are still relevant to my life today.
Yeah, that's really good. And of course, the corporate side of your career to date, as obviously you've been in contact with lots of leaders over the course of your career. And I'm very interested in the title of your book. Obviously, an Amazon bestseller, well regarded. But it's a very punchy title. We need new leaders is pretty straightforward and to the point. So when you say that we need new leaders, what's at the heart of that? What are you actually tapping into? What's the sort of the real takeaways that you need people to understand when you talk about new leaders? And I ask that in a context of a very fast moving, changeable world that we're in today.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things I say in the book. The one is that we're in a crisis of leadership. So a decision made by one leader who's in power can have ramifications around the whole world. And business leaders have to operate in those contexts. So the crisis of leaders creates a crisis for leaders. And if you look what happened in the US last year, I mean, I finished my book on the 1st of November. At that stage, we didn't know who would be president of the United States. Just taking a diversity lens, decisions made by the new US president have completely changed how companies all over the world deal with diversity. So business leaders are having to operate in that context. And my title, We Need New Leaders, I admit it's punchy and it is attention grabbing. But the idea behind it is that we have this old archetype of leadership in our heads. It's almost our neuroscience. It sits in the back of our brains, and it's loud, it's room owning, it's a particular kind of energy, it's potentially masculine, and it doesn't seem to be serving us in the world right now. So I'm saying we need to crack open the door for a new kind of leadership that is more diverse, that is more inclusive, that listens, that is curious, that is empathetic. And so what I did with the book was go out and interview 40 leaders of diverse identities, diverse backgrounds, and underrepresented minorities, both established leaders, so very senior, and emerging leaders, to understand how they thought about leadership, diversity, and reputation.
Yeah, and it's interesting in terms of you mentioned, for example, diversity. Um, and I was also listening to something earlier today with the Institute of Directors, and the tariff situation, not as headlining as it when you were actually finishing penning the book, but how leaders have had to adapt to that as well, and AI, how leaders have had to adapt to that. There's an awful lot of adaptation and flexibility, and this sort of need to be agile. And then you've sort of encapsulated that in this new sort of leader that we kind of need at the moment, don't we? Because the old ways of leading don't seem okay. We've been through a pandemic. People want to work in different ways and with different cultures and ethos, and they want to make sure that they're working for the right company. It's not just about getting a job anymore. Do you feel when you're talking to CEOs and founders that there is a big gap between where, I know I'm sort of generalizing, but where business leadership is at the moment compared to where you think we need to be? Or do you think that with a little bit of adjustment and some key learnings, we can easily make that transition? Because from where I sit, Charlotte, there are quite a few gaps that I'm seeing, even at the biggest companies.
I think adaptability is everything. I think that you said it, with I mean, for years, I was head of executive comms at SAP. For years, I wrote about the pace of change. Well, we're living it now. We don't know what the global employment and workforce is going to look like in 5 years' time. So leaders have to be beyond adaptable. And adaptability doesn't fit with top down command and control. You do this and you shut up. The only way leaders are going to lead their companies into the future is if they are comfortable with being agile, being adaptable, changing on the fly, listening to their people, being empathetic, being curious. So those new qualities that I talk about a lot in the book are actually the qualities that are going to help businesses and leaders survive in the future.
And the interviews that you've done with people, you're no stranger to the world of podcast and media and being in front of the camera. And you're often on the other side of the desk asking the questions. So, what do you find about hosting a show, hosting that type of media? Is that beneficial to what you do, Charlotte? Because I'm assuming it helps you keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening out there too.
Yeah, so thank you for mentioning my podcast. My podcast is called Speech Bubbles, and I started it out honestly as a marketing tool for the book. So in the first season, I interviewed many of the folks who I interviewed for the book. And then what started to happen, it's probably happened with you as well, is that people start to say, "Oh, I'd love to come on your podcast. I have this position, I have that idea." So it's taken on a little bit of a life of its own. Um, I come quite well prepared for my podcast, but I also prepare for serendipity. And I think that's my journalism training coming out again. So I always start my podcast with an interesting quote by that person, something a little bit provocative, and then we take it from there. And I've had to put my own, not necessarily need for control, but my own need to plan to the test hosting a podcast. So I've learned to be able to think on my feet, be a little bit more spontaneous, enjoy the serendipity, enjoy being curious, and enjoy listening. So I've enjoyed quite a lot of personal growth myself doing the podcast.
It's great to hear. And of course, we recommend everybody goes and subscribes to that straight away. And I'm going to throw a quote at you if I can, because I know you talk about reputation equity. And you talk about that as being this insurance policy almost against the unexpected, against something unplanned happening in the not too distant future. So could you just unpack reputation equity a little bit for our listeners?
Yeah, so the academic side of reputation is that it's hard to define and incredibly expensive to lose. So CEOs and businesses know this. They have insurance against losing their reputation. But for individuals, and particularly for my target market, which is leaders from diverse backgrounds, diverse identities, and underrepresented minorities, the importance of owning your own story, the importance of voicing your story out loud. So one of the authors who I lent on in writing my book is Mary Ann Sieghart, who wrote The Authority Gap. And, you know, she talks about how having a stellar record of success is a buffer against bias in the workplace. And my emphasis is on that word record. It's not enough for leaders just to do a good job. That's only 50% of the work. The other half of it is talking about how you've done a good job. You create that record of success actively yourself, not only internally in your company. You know, we have brilliant social media tools for people to tell their stories all the time. And it's not just being self-promotional and boasty. You can also talk about the hardship or the struggles or the mistakes that you made along the way or the things that you learned that you've now corrected. You can also build communities online. You can find the people who are interested in the same things as you. So there's a whole plethora of tools out there for leaders to use to build that record of success. And as I interview more folks now, I realize that a leader from a diverse background who owns their own reputation and tells their story out loud is not only representing, you know, we talk about representation a lot, but by talking about the steps that it took to get there, you're actually creating a bridge for the next generation. So when I was growing up, my mother and the mothers of my friends all worked. There were nurses, there were teachers, there were secretaries. I had no examples of female leaders in corporate. But now we have female leaders in corporate who are building their reputations out loud and online so that ambitious young women like as I was can see the steps, understand the path, and actually walk across that bridge.
As you've been speaking, Charlotte, I've wrote down two book titles, and one was Beyond Adaptable, because you mentioned that earlier, and the other one is Out Loud and Online. I think they're both great ways of capturing that. And I got a question for you, though, because it sounds somewhat like a task that needs to be done. We also know how important it is. And I really liked when you were saying, it's not enough just to do the thing. You've also got to sort of share that story. But I know that you like, in particular, working with CEOs to help them find that story, because sometimes those stories can be buried or they're not sharing them. How do you actually go about doing that in practice, though? Because CEOs, at least in my humble experience, come in all shapes and sizes.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you asking that question. And it goes to my program, which is called the Reputation 360. And this is something I've evolved over years of working as an executive communicator and as a journalist. So what I do is a series of very in-depth interviews with the individual in question. I have a set of questions, but I regard each question as a jumping off point for deeper conversation. And when that person is talking, I'm listening for that moment where they light up from the inside. And you know when it happens with somebody, you always get goosebumps because it's that moment of human connection where they're telling a story and it comes from such a genuine beautiful place. And that's the moment where I'm furiously taking notes and thinking, okay, this is a story that you can tell. And then in addition, I do a number of interviews around that person, asking a subset of the questions, because reputation goes two ways. And it may be a leader thinks a certain set of things about themselves, but the people around them think something differently. And it came up very interestingly with one of my clients who was a CFO who'd been promoted by the board to CEO. Because he'd been a CFO, he was very shy. He had 300 followers on LinkedIn. He hated the idea of social media. He was sending his head of comms to media interviews. And the board said to him, this has to change. And by doing the 360, what I was able to reflect back to him was that the people who he trusted and respected saw him as an innovator, not only for his business, but for his entire industry. And that by being shy and silent, he was doing a disservice to the industry. And he now has 10,000 followers and he's regarded as a thought leader. So he didn't want to hear it from me. I could have talked till I was blue in the face telling him that he needed to be a thought leader, but the people around him who he respected and trusted, those were the people he was prepared to listen to.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And it kind of, when you started off talking now, you're talking about a CEO as a little bit shy, maybe a little bit introverted to some degree. And I know that you wrote something for entrepreneur.com, which is a very popular site back a few months ago, well, probably a little bit earlier in the year at the time of recording. And you were talking about building your own reputation, your leadership reputation, before you're even in the room, right? And I'm just wondering how you convey that message of why that strong reputation is so important, so vital, when maybe some of these people are a little reluctant to engage, maybe?
Oh, look, I come from the position speaking as an introvert myself, and I didn't know I was until COVID. It's amazing what we learned about ourselves during the pandemic. But people who are introverted have got deep thoughts and lots to say. They just need to be given permission and comfortable spaces. So it's about finding the way of showing up and speaking that's comfortable for a person. So I worked with one executive who hated doing keynotes. He had to. So what I would do is always make sure there were 3 or 4 experts on stage who he just came in, did the hello and goodbye, and the experts carried most of the keynote. But I realized working with him, he was brilliant in rooms of 20. So I tried to make sure that as much of his communications as possible happened in rooms of 20. So it's a lot about finding where you're most comfortable. It's also about finding those passions, those things that make you light up from the inside. And then it's about your values and your purpose, because as I said earlier, a female CEO may feel shy or may feel that always being on LinkedIn is some form of self-promotion, but actually showing the steps and showing the journey is a form of altruism. So I think it's about helping people to just shift their mindset a little bit.
Do you think people have a mixed view of how they think they appear to other people and how they actually appear to other people? And how do you bridge that gap, Charlotte?
Yeah, I think it can be possible. And that's part of the reason why I do the 360 is that I'm looking for anomalies. I'm looking for surprises. I'm looking for moments or information or data that to find out in advance so I can talk that through with the leader. But I think once they have that information and they have that data, it's much easier to work with it. However, I did have one leader say to me during the podcast, I asked her how she thought about her own reputation. And she said to me, it was the most beautiful answer and very short and snappy. She said to me, if I know what my values are, if I always show up according to my values in a way that is authentic to me, always show up, my reputation takes care of itself. And what it goes to, and actually what came up so much in my book, is it goes to self-knowledge. If you know who you are, if you understand yourself, if you've done the work, if you know what your values are, if you have your purpose mapped out, those anomalies aren't going to show up.
Yeah, again, I agree. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose I'd like to maybe touch on storytelling a little bit because we're talking an awful lot about reputation, managing your reputation, understanding how important it is. But there's an art to storytelling too. So it's not just a matter of, well, Charlotte writes it all down and tells me what I need to do, because the way they communicate that message that's genuine to them, we hear the word authentic a lot these days, don't we? Could you maybe tell me a bit more about the art of storytelling, and how do you work with CEOs to make sure that that part isn't missed? Because you can have all the info, doesn't necessarily mean that it's conveyed correctly, right?
Yeah, I think that that sense of I need to be up on stage and be a wonderful storyteller like a comedian or an actor, I think it kind of makes a lot of leaders freeze in terror. And all I'm really saying is just be a little bit more human. You don't have to tell the best story ever, but tell a story. And stories create that connectivity between us as humans. It's all about tiny details. So if you're a sales leader and you talk about, you went to visit a customer in Paris, and it was a bank and the sales deal was threatened, add the details. It was a rainy day in Paris. The rain was pouring down. The windscreen wipers were struggling to clear in the taxi that I was in. I was so worried about the sales deal. Then I got there, the people looked gloomy, but I managed to turn the deal around, and then the sun came out. But it's just tiny details. We don't all have to be the next great comedian or the next great actor, but just humanize your experiences and your stories with those little details that connect us.
Yeah, that's great. Great tips, great advice. And you mentioned SAP earlier, and obviously you were in a senior role there. You were looking after the executive communications, right, and employee communications too. So a really important pivotal role for a company like that. And I'm just wondering though, because sometimes executives or leaders, you can get so busy, you forget to work on your own reputation. Not talking about the company reputation now, I'm talking about a personal reputation. Do you see much of that happening where people are just so busy, they don't either pay the right amount of time or attention to personal uh, profiles or personal um, commitment of time, because you're busy running the company, doing whatever you do in your various departments, and seem to be on that hamster wheel, don't we?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, and it's a real challenge for leaders who are working at huge companies, and a real challenge for their communicators trying to persuade them to communicate. And my feeling for 10 years was I was banging down the door saying, you must talk about this. Um, Yeah, it really it's not particularly easy, but one of the things that came up in my research on reputation is that the more proactively leaders work on their own reputation and that of the company by telling stories, by building relationships, by making those human connections. The moment when crisis arrives, and it does usually arrive at some point, they've created a level of trust with their audiences, and they've created what's known as a reputational moat that protects them. If you, as a leader, suddenly start communicating when the crisis hits, it's far, far too late. And crises are usually expensive. So, for communicators, the best way to explain how important communications is through this lens of it's going to cost you if you don't communicate in advance. So that what came up in my research is that actually a lot of leaders do think about that proactive reputation management.
Yeah. And just coming back to the people that you were talking to about when you were writing the book, because there were 40, if I think, people, some of them very established leaders, some maybe emerging leaders. Did you see any patterns through that? Like, has everybody got the same two or three problems and then a little bit of personalization? Or is everybody different and unique in your opinion, Charlotte?
Everybody's wildly different, but the commonality that I found was that because these leaders came from diverse identities, backgrounds, and underrepresented minorities. All of them had faced obstacles to get where they were. And through those obstacles, had to do a lot of work on themselves, had deep self-knowledge and self-awareness, which meant that they had empathy, which meant that they were incredibly thoughtful about how they showed up at work, incredibly thoughtful about the language that they used, thoughtful about how they led their teams. And so it felt like a through line from obstacle to self-knowledge to empathy to really wonderful leadership. And that was a very interesting and surprising outcome for me.
Well, before we run out of time, Charlotte, I want to ask you, if you can, just to take a moment, because people watching or listening to us here today or on the recording, they're going to want to find out how to get in touch with you. Where do they get a copy of the book? Where do they find your Substack? Where's the podcast, Speech Bubbles? You know, what's the website? So maybe take a moment and tell, if people want to reach out to you, find out more about all these great things we're talking about, where do you want to send them to, Charlotte?
Well, it's very kind of you to offer me that. My website is charlotteotter.com. There is a link to my Substack newsletter, also to the podcast, although Speech Bubbles can also be found wherever people get their podcasts, on Apple and Spotify. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm extremely active and friendly. If people want to come and make friends with me there, they're very, very welcome to do so.
Well, that's great. And thank you for sharing that. And look, before we wrap up, is there any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with, or any sort of key takeaways that we can share with our audience before we wrap up today, Charlotte? Anything that springs to mind?
So for most of us, whether we're leaders or not, we don't have a PR person who's coming to sort it all out for us and tell our stories. So the onus is on us to build our own reputations, and LinkedIn is a fantastic platform. All your customers are there, all your employees are there, all your future employees are there. It's because LinkedIn is not anonymous. It's also one of the more neutral to positive platforms. So there's not a lot of terrible amount of trolling. And the onus is on you as a leader, an emerging leader, somebody with ambitions to lead, to use it as a place to build your reputation and your reputational moat.
That's a great point to end on, and it's unfortunate, but we've run out of time today. I want to thank our audience for watching or listening to this episode around the world. I'm going to ask them to, follow, like, subscribe, do everything I did them to do to help support this show, and also go and check out all the great things that Charlotte Otter is working on, whether it's the book, the Substack, get involved in the 360. Find out a little bit more. There's a wealth of knowledge there, and of course, the podcast episode's certainly worth a listen. But I hope you'll join me back here for some more conversations with creatives and leaders and thinkers just like Charlotte. Charlotte, it's been wonderful to talk to you today. Thanks for sharing a bit about your journey and an awful lot about your reputation, how you manage that, how you succeed in that. And I really appreciate you being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Simon. It's been great.